They made him clean up spilled coffee in front of the entire board, dressed in a suit, holding a resume thicker than anyone in that room, just because his skin was black and his name didn't sound expensive enough. They called it a mistake. They laughed like he wasn't standing there. They demoted him without saying a word, erased his name from the team he built, and made him sit on a plastic chair in the corner like furniture. But what none of them knew was that the man they humiliated held the key to everything: their deals, their reputations, their future. This isn't just another story about workplace racism. This is the slow, brutal rise of someone they thought they could break, and the quiet storm he brought when the truth came out. If you're watching, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? Because this story, once it starts, doesn't let go. Dillon's strategic partners looked down on the city like a throne of glass and steel, its windows cold and immaculate in the early morning haze. The skyline had barely shaken off the weight of dawn, but on the 37th floor, fluorescent lights hummed with purpose, and the smell of polished surfaces and strong coffee thickened the air. Dorian Keene stepped out of the elevator 5 minutes early, as he always did, briefcase in hand, tie-centered, not a crease out of place. The hallway stretched quiet before him, the corridor of power that led to the boardroom, the room he had earned his way into with years of work, discipline, and results. He walked steadily toward it, passing portraits of founding partners and etched mission statements mounted in brushed steel. Everything about this place screamed legacy, and for a time, he believed he was becoming part of it. But something was wrong today. As he entered the boardroom, the first thing he noticed was the absence of his nameplate. The long walnut conference table gleamed under recessed lighting, laid out meticulously with 9 leather-bound portfolios, water glasses, pens aligned with surgical precision. There were 9 seats arranged evenly around the table. He was the 10th man. For a moment, Dorian stood still. His eyes moved along the edge of the table, searching for a misplaced folder, a spare seat, even a gesture of inclusion. But then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, beneath the towering window that overlooked the western skyline, sat a plastic chair, beige, scuffed, without a table, without even armrests. It looked as though it had been pulled from a utility closet. It faced away from the screen. No cable access, no charger, no voice. Just a chair. A few steps behind him, a young intern hovered awkwardly by the doorway, her tablet clutched tightly to her chest. He turned, catching her eyes. She flinched slightly, then offered a brittle half-smile and muttered that Mr. Dillon had made a few adjustments. Her voice trailed off as if she'd already said too much. Dorian nodded slowly, lips pressed in a straight line. He walked toward the corner and sat without a word. The plastic groaned softly beneath him. The conference room door opened behind him in regular intervals. Laughter and voices filled the space as the senior staff began arriving. They filled their seats around the table, adjusted their jackets, commented on the coffee. No one looked in Dorian's direction. The seat he once occupied had a fresh nameplate now, Caleb Stroud, newly promoted, fresh from grad school, and still unused to wearing cufflinks. Greg Dillon, the founder's son and current CEO, swept into the room precisely at 8. He was dressed in an immaculate navy suit with silver cufflinks that caught the light. His voice boomed with effortless command as he called the meeting to order. Not once did his eyes flicker toward the corner. The first few topics rolled out quickly. Division performances, resource allocations, restructuring ideas. When supply chain operations appeared on the main screen, a department Dorian had built from 2 people and a spare server rack to one of the company's highest performing branches, Greg spoke of its success with measured praise. Then he turned toward Caleb and credited him for its agility. Caleb accepted the compliment with a gracious nod, avoiding Dorian's gaze. No one corrected the attribution. No one even hesitated. Dorian sat motionless, his hands still, his expression unreadable. When projections were displayed, he saw his own risk forecasts, data he had prepared meticulously the week before, but the slide formatting was changed. The headers reworded, his initials scrubbed. Another man's logo placed in the corner. He didn't blink. Greg moved through the material efficiently, then paused and asked for coffee. with a glance toward the interns, then toward the corner of the room. He smiled and asked Dorian to handle it. Said they were short-staffed this morning. The room chuckled softly. Dorian stood without pause, collected the empty mugs around the table, and left. The hallway was silent. The kitchenette was stocked and bright. He brewed the coffee, selected the cream and sweetener preferences he'd memorized over years of meetings. He balanced the tray and returned, distributing each cup with precision. He knew who preferred black, who took cream, who liked cinnamon. He knew because he had earned his way here, or thought he had. The meeting resumed. As new partnerships were discussed, his voice was never requested. When the question of overseas compliance arose, his specialty, the group turned instead to Mallory Singh, who offered half an answer and a quick change of topic. Greg nodded and moved on. Later, an announcement was made. The firm was launching a new internal mentorship initiative aimed at developing high-potential talent from diverse backgrounds. The room clapped politely. Greg mentioned the word diversity with a measured pause and allowed his gaze to drift, ever so briefly, toward the corner of the room. Dorian did not move. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped back. Jackets were shrugged on. Portfolios clicked closed. Greg reminded everyone of the cocktail reception later that week and joked about the firm's growing pains. As the room cleared, no one spoke to Dorian. Some glanced in his direction, some didn't. The intern by the door met his eyes once, then looked down quickly and left. The ride down felt longer than usual. When the doors opened to the lobby, he moved with purpose, not because he had somewhere to be, but because he had to act like he did. In the office culture Greg Dillon had cultivated, movement implied relevance, and stillness was synonymous with waiting to be replaced. Dorian returned to his cubicle, not the glass-walled office he'd occupied last quarter, but the compact workstation he'd been reassigned to after the department reshuffle. The memo announcing the change had arrived on a Saturday morning, addressed vaguely to affected staff, and when Dorian entered the building the following Monday, he found his name stripped from the door and his personal effects stacked neatly in a box. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a new floor plan and a quiet invitation to adapt. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now his workstation sat adjacent to the break room. The scent of microwave fish and vending machine coffee lingered in the air. Interns passed by regularly, whispering as they filled their water bottles, unsure whether to greet him or avoid eye contact. The younger ones had once sought his mentorship. Now they barely met his gaze. Dorian logged into his terminal, only to find his access to internal strategy files revoked. A red error banner blinked across his dashboard. Insufficient permissions. He blinked, then refreshed. Same message. He tried accessing the quarterly forecasts, then the project documentation for the initiative he developed last quarter. Blocked. His ID no longer matched any of the folders he'd created. He opened his inbox and drafted a message to IT asking about the sudden restrictions, but hesitated before sending it. Something told him the change hadn't originated with a system update. Across the floor, Caleb strolled by, chatting loudly with a client over Bluetooth. His voice carried effortlessly, laced with exaggerated familiarity. Dorian caught fragments: supply optimization, vendor strategy, rollout timeline, all language he recognized, pulled from decks he'd spent nights refining. But now the words were Caleb's. Dorian watched him vanish around the corner, disappearing into an office that had once been his. The bitterness in his throat was sharp, not from envy, but from betrayal wrapped in civility. By mid-afternoon, a meeting invite popped into his calendar titled Alignment Sync, Operational Improvements. It was scheduled for 3:15 p.m. in the Raven Room, a small conference space typically reserved for external audits. The organizer was Brenda Cobb from HR. No agenda was attached. He arrived on time. Inside, Brenda sat across from a panel of 3 middle managers he recognized only in passing. None worked directly with him. A folder sat open in front of her. She began by complimenting his early contributions to Dillon's strategic partners, then segued into the firm's current needs for agility and fresh perspectives. There had been concerns, she said, about his ability to adapt. Feedback, she called it, though none of it had names. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable. She explained that going forward, his responsibilities would shift toward internal infrastructure support. He would assist facilities with vendor management and workspace utilization. The role was temporary, she said. Developmental. He would retain his current salary but lose discretionary bonuses, given the shift in performance metrics. She handed him a badge marked Logistics Liaison and asked him to sign a confirmation form. Dorian signed, then stood, then left. When he returned to his desk, he found his monitor had been logged off remotely. A message hovered on screen. Workstation reassignment in progress. Please relocate to sublevel 2. Sublevel 2 was technically part of the Dillon building, but it wasn't accessible by the main elevators. It required a separate keycard, the kind given to facilities, personnel, and document runners. He walked past the executive floors, past the polished conference centers, down a maintenance stairwell that smelled faintly of concrete and disinfectant. Sublevel 2 was quiet, cool. The ceiling was lower, the carpet a thin, industrial weave. His new workstation sat beside a storage closet labeled Janitorial Reserves. A portable desk, no window. A phone that rang twice that day, both times by mistake. His new task list arrived via email. Facility reporting, supply restocking oversight, printer allocation audits. No meetings. No que la verás, Chin. Just a list. That Friday, as Dorian reviewed floor plans for upcoming renovations, he noticed his name had been removed from every previously filed proposal. Every version marked original had been replaced with revised. And the revised ones bore different initials. Not just Caleb's now, but also those of Mallory Run Jackson, executives who hadn't touched the data. The original versions were gone, deleted. The metadata had been scrubbed. Dorian closed the files without reacting. When he checked the internal team page, his photo was still there, but his title had been altered from Director of Systems Planning to Department Resource Consultant. A subtle edit, easily missed, but intentional. He hovered over it for a moment, then clicked away. At 5:30, he rose from his desk and walked back to the elevator. The main system no longer recognized his access card, so he waited by the service lift. It smelled of cardboard and oil. As the doors closed, he leaned against the panel and closed his eyes. He didn't feel anger, not yet. Just a quiet hollowness, like a page that had been erased too cleanly. At street level, he walked west toward the train station. He didn't look back at the building, didn't glance at the floors above. The elevator seemed slower than usual. When it opened, a pair of junior associates stepped out, chatting about a product launch. But they both went silent when they saw him, their eyes flicking briefly toward his chest before lowering. He knew why. His new badge, though still technically valid, was missing the firm's blue executive overlay. It was subtle, but anyone who worked at Dillon knew what it meant. As he rode the elevator down to sublevel 2, he noticed that the panel's backlight flickered where his floor button used to glow steadily. The small things, he thought. They always started with small things. His desk, still positioned outside the janitorial closet, looked untouched since yesterday. No messages, no directives, no greetings from passing staff. The air was cooler here, drier, almost sterile. He sat down, opened his inbox, and found only an automated alert reminding him to complete a quarterly ethics training module, something he'd helped design in its early versions. He opened the link, began the training, and completed the quiz without reading a word. The system recorded his score, filed it away, and closed the window without ceremony. Just after 9, a courier arrived with a cart of boxed marketing materials destined for a client presentation on the upper floors. The delivery had been logged incorrectly, so the facilities team routed it through his department. The courier was new, young, and unsure where to go. He asked Dorian if he was in charge of building services. Dorian paused before answering, then nodded once and took the clipboard. As he signed for the delivery, his pen scratched across the line where someone else's name had been printed. His name, in fact, but with the title Assistant Facilities Liaison scribbled in ink over the original. He said nothing, took the boxes, pushed the cart himself down the hallway. As he wheeled it into the service elevator, he caught his reflection in the metal door, a faint outline, distorted by the brushed finish, no longer sharp or commanding. He delivered the materials to the appropriate conference suite on the 30th floor. No one noticed him. He stood silently at the back of a room as the senior team joked over catered breakfast, watching Caleb flip through the slide deck he himself had once presented. The assistant project manager thanked him for the boxes, then turned and continued her conversation without waiting for a response. He took the elevator back down without pressing any additional buttons. Just before lunch, Dorian received an invitation to a peer engagement event titled Executive Pulse. The invite was mass distributed, but his copy was the only one addressed without a department designation. Instead of RSVP options, the system displayed an error message when he clicked respond. Later that afternoon, while reviewing office floor plans for a storage reallocation, he noticed that his old office had been completely reconfigured. Not just the nameplate, not just the decor, but the furniture itself had been changed. The layout was reversed. The table he'd installed personally had been replaced with a generic boardroom unit. His ergonomic chair, the one his wife had given him before her diagnosis, was gone. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the window. He didn't want to know where it had gone. At 2:15, an announcement was made over the internal comm system about a departmental achievement award. The video montage featured clips from recent campaigns and highlighted key team members. Dorian watched in silence as image after image flashed by. In one of them, a blurred figure could be seen in the corner, lifting a stack of boxes, head turned away. He recognized the suit. It was his. No one else did. He walked to the restroom afterward and stood at the sink without washing his hands, staring at his face in the mirror. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. His tie looked too tight, his collar too stiff. The mirror was slightly warped near the edge, just enough to make him look like a stranger. When he returned to his desk, the screen displayed a pop-up. Reminder, please confirm your availability for Wednesday's cross-departmental facilities audit. He hadn't been told about any audit. He opened the calendar. Nothing was listed, but the system flagged his silence as non-compliance. Another reminder appeared an hour later, this time copied to a facilities lead and a junior HR associate he didn't recognize. When he reached out for clarification, the HR associate responded with a templated message. Thank you for your inquiry. Your participation has been noted. No additional information followed. That evening, as he gathered his things to leave, the lights above his desk dimmed suddenly. Motion sensors, he realized. No one had passed this way in hours. The system thought the area was unoccupied. As he stepped into the stairwell, now his regular exit due to badge access inconsistencies, he passed Greg Dillon, speaking with two partners near the lobby. Their conversation paused momentarily. Greg glanced over, then continued without acknowledgement. Dorian stepped outside into the cooling evening air. The traffic roared in the distance, the wind lifting the edge of his coat as if trying to nudge him back inside. He didn't return the next day until noon. No one noticed the delay. His inbox held no messages. His phone had not rung. On Thursday, someone left a wrapped sandwich on his desk without a note. Chicken salad on rye, his least favorite. He didn't touch it. On Friday, his chair was missing when he arrived. He stood for 47 minutes before finding a folding one in the storage closet. He didn't ask who had taken it. No one offered an explanation. He stopped attending lunch, stopped greeting people in the hallway. The week blurred into silence. No meetings, no updates, no mention of his name in any distribution list, though he remained on payroll. On paper, he still worked for Dillon Strategic Partners. In practice, he was a ghost, a fixture, a shadow in a forgotten corridor. He began to measure time not by deliverables or progress, but by the way his presence shifted reactions, how people's voices dropped when he entered a room, how their eyes darted to the floor, how they laughed louder once he passed. He was not just being overlooked now. He was being unacknowledged. Over the past 3 weeks, he had grown familiar with the steady, deliberate stripping of his presence, the surgical removal of recognition, the corporate precision with which invisibility had been assigned to him like a new job title. Still, this morning began differently. A global product launch was scheduled, a campaign Dorian had once been slated to co-lead before his reassignment, and as part of the firm-wide tradition, all department heads were expected to attend the early executive breakfast. When Dorian arrived at the executive floor, there were signs welcoming team leads, polished directional placards guiding invited guests, and a hostess who offered warm smiles to those exiting the elevators. But when Dorian reached the check-in table, her smile froze. Her eyes darted to the screen in front of her, then back to his badge, then down again. She apologized and explained that his name wasn't on the approved guest list. Dorian asked her to check again. She did. Then, after an awkward pause, she called someone quietly through her earpiece and nodded several times. Finally, she motioned for him to step aside, offered a complimentary coffee voucher for the cafe in the lower lobby, and gently said the event was at capacity. As Dorian stepped away, Caleb passed by, laughing with another executive, shaking hands, backslapping. He looked over, saw Dorian standing at the side of the check-in area, said nothing, and walked on. Dorian turned and rode the elevator down to the lobby cafe, but he did not redeem the voucher. Instead, he sat on a bench across from the elevator bank, watching as partner after partner arrived, greeted, smiled, and disappeared up to the rooftop lounge where the breakfast was held. By mid-morning, he returned to sublevel 2 and opened his email. One new message awaited him from facilities scheduling. He had been assigned as the liaison for a hospitality setup later that afternoon in one of the executive suites. The task included coordinating third-party staff, ensuring refreshments were restocked, and managing cleanup between sessions. No one explained why this had landed on his desk. He completed it anyway. At 2:15, he arrived at the suite. The catering staff was already unloading trays of hors d'oeuvres, and as he stepped into the room to inspect the seating layout, a junior associate looked up and asked which service he represented. Dorian answered that he worked for Dylan. She blinked, looked at his badge, then said, "Oh, of course," but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had just mistaken a surgeon for a custodian. He adjusted the table settings, ensured the name tags were properly aligned, and confirmed the ice buckets were placed according to the diagram provided. When the guests arrived, he stepped into the hall. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. During that time, he stood outside the suite, making sure no interruptions occurred. No one invited him in. When the final guest left, Dorian stepped back inside, tidied the room, collected discarded napkins, and waited for the caterers to return. As he turned to leave, he noticed that the projector had been left on, still displaying the final slide from the meeting, an organizational chart of upcoming project leads. His name was nowhere on it. In the center, smiling in a professional headshot, was Caleb under the title Executive Director, Global Product Expansion. Dorian stared at the slide for a full minute, then turned off the projector, walked to the service stairwell, and descended alone. That evening, just before leaving, he passed by the main conference corridor where a new installation had been completed. The firm had hung portraits of its senior leadership in a gallery-style display. Framed images lined the wall, each one captioned with titles and brief summaries of achievements. Dorian found the space where his photo had once been. It was now replaced by a framed quote attributed to Greg Dillon about perseverance and bold leadership. Dorian stood in front of it for a long moment, reading the quote twice, trying to determine if it had been written specifically to replace him or if it was simply a convenient fit. Either way, the message was clear. The face was gone. The words were generic. The space had been taken. On Tuesday, a department-wide social hour was held on the 12th floor terrace. Dorian received the invitation through a forwarded email from someone in office services, not HR or executive leadership. The message contained no greeting, no personalization, and no RSVP request. Just a note that setup help was appreciated. He showed up 15 minutes early. No one acknowledged his arrival. He arranged stools, adjusted sun umbrellas, unpacked drink buckets. When the other employees arrived, he retreated to the far end of the terrace near the potted ferns and remained standing. One of the assistants approached him with a plate of appetizers and asked if he needed help bussing them. When he explained he worked for the firm, she apologized, then laughed awkwardly and walked away. A few feet away, two junior managers debated whether he was the new floor coordinator or the head of security. He heard both versions. Neither made sense. Neither prompted correction. He left before the event ended, though no one noticed. Wednesday morning brought a new humiliation. His weekly passkey to the resource server failed. When he contacted IT, they said his access was part of a phased deactivation under current restructuring. When he asked why he had not been informed, the technician said a company-wide email had been sent last week. He never received it. When he checked his spam folder, he found it there, tagged as promotional content. Thursday, he arrived to find a maintenance sign posted beside his workstation. Vet paint. The wall had been repainted overnight. A note said the desk was temporarily reassigned and that he should relocate to an open conference room. He wandered from room to room before finding one available, a space with no power strip, no functional outlets, and a broken chair. He stayed there all day. No one came to check on him. No one brought him updates. The room smelled faintly of mildew. On Friday, the firm hosted a diversity recognition luncheon in the central atrium. A caterer accidentally directed Dorian to the staging area for volunteers and support staff. He was handed a name tag without a department, told to help seat guests, and asked if he had extra gloves. Dorian stood there for several seconds, holding the blank tag, surrounded by people who assumed he was there to assist. Across the atrium, Greg stood under a banner about inclusion, raising a glass to new beginnings. Caleb clapped beside him. He passed Caleb in the hallway that morning, dressed in a crisp gray suit, speaking loudly on a Bluetooth earpiece about international rollout strategies. Words that used to belong to Dorian's mouth now echoed from someone else's with none of the original weight. Caleb nodded as they crossed paths, an automatic gesture, as if Dorian were a hallway fixture. Dorian kept walking. At 9:30, an urgent email appeared in his inbox. It was marked priority, flagged by a senior partner, and labeled with the subject line, "Clarification required operations approval." When Dorian opened the message, he found a forwarded thread containing a high-level project proposal he had not authored. The plan contained a strategic outline filled with glaring errors, incorrect vendor assessments, and unapproved budget ranges. His name, however, had been attached to the final sign-off field. Someone had rerouted it through his dormant credentials. The message from the senior partner asked him to appear at a cross-functional review at 10:15 in the Cedar conference room. No explanation. No opportunity to prepare. He closed the laptop, straightened his jacket, and walked to the conference floor. The room was already filled when he arrived. Around the table sat managers from product, compliance, and legal. Greg Dillon stood at the far end, his expression unreadable. Dorian stepped inside, waited for a seat to be offered, but none was. He stood near the wall. The partner from legal spoke first, asking about a misstep in the vendor assessment for a multi-million-dollar supply partnership. She asked whether Dorian had verified the financial stability of the recommended firm. He answered that he had not been involved in that phase of planning. The manager from compliance followed, asking why certain budgetary thresholds had been greenlit under his initials. Again, he answered that the form had been rerouted without his knowledge. Greg finally spoke, asking if he was suggesting his digital credentials had been misused. Dorian nodded, choosing his words carefully. Greg paused, then smiled faintly and turned to the rest of the room, saying that perhaps this was just a misunderstanding, the result of so many simultaneous systems updates. The room offered soft chuckles, but the tension remained. The meeting ended without resolution. Dorian left without speaking to anyone else. Back at his desk, he found that the digital form in question had already been removed from his history log. It was as if the entire thing had never existed, except now the doubt had been planted. His reliability was under quiet review. 2 hours later, Another email arrived from Human Resources requesting that he complete a feedback survey regarding team collaboration. The questions were loaded with phrases like interpersonal friction, performance transparency, and department engagement. Dorian answered each one truthfully. No room for collaboration. No current engagement. No meaningful contact with his team. When he submitted it, an error flashed on the screen. Response not recorded. Please contact system administrator. That afternoon, he was called into a touchpoint meeting with Caleb and a mid-tier partner named Wilson. The stated purpose was to revisit historical workflows and identify areas for efficiency. In practice, it was a dissection. Caleb brought up project delays from earlier in the year. Initiatives Dorian had been removed from months ago, but were still listed under his early documentation. Wilson asked why certain phases had missed deadlines. Dorian explained that his access had been revoked during those months. Caleb countered by suggesting that Dorian could have reached out for clarity if he had truly cared about project success. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Dorian sat still, watching as his own language, his own leadership frameworks, were repurposed and used against him, twisted into metrics of inaction. He understood now. He wasn't being ignored anymore. He was being set up, targeted, isolated first, then marked as unreliable. The process was too neat to be improvised. It was coordinated, with just enough plausible deniability to shield those behind it. The next morning, a company-wide training session was held on conflict resolution and inclusive communication. The slides featured scenarios about miscommunication, implicit bias, and professional accountability. Dorian's example was featured as a case study, though unnamed, an anonymous employee who had failed to document decisions clearly, resulting in confusion and fractured partnerships. No one said his name. They didn't have to. He recognized the dates, the references, the language. Others did too. He could see it in the sideways glances, in the whispered questions, in the deliberate avoidance during the post-training discussion groups. Later that day, he passed Greg in the hallway. The CEO smiled, clapped him on the back, and said it's good to be humble sometimes. Then he walked away without waiting for a reply. On Thursday, a printed memo appeared on Dorian's desk. Not emailed, not digital, printed. It was a reminder of company policy regarding workplace demeanor, focusing on passive noncompliance and emotional distancing. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was placed neatly beside his keyboard. That evening, as he prepared to leave, he received an invitation to a performance checkpoint. The calendar entry included a private meeting with 2 senior directors and the head of HR. The title, Concerns and Forward Motion. Dorian closed his laptop slowly. He knew the game now. As he passed through the security checkpoint, the guard on duty hesitated, scanned his badge twice, then handed it back with a shrug and a muttered, "I guess it still works," a phrase that lingered longer than it should have. He took the freight elevator because his main access panel no longer responded to his card. And when the doors opened on sublevel 2, the hallway lights were already dimmed to energy-saving mode, leaving his corner cast in a half-shadow. His desk was still there, technically, though the space had been reclassified under storage management on the new layout distributed that morning. His name no longer appeared on the employee directory, not even in the hidden access view. When he attempted to log into the company's internal system, a new message greeted him. Account temporarily suspended. Please contact administrator. He didn't bother contacting anyone. He sat down, opened his notebook, and began listing all the names of former team members whose careers he had helped shape, whose promotions he had recommended, whose workloads he had balanced. As he wrote, none of them came. At 10:30, an assistant from events approached and asked if he would be available to help coordinate seating for the quarterly town hall scheduled for noon in the atrium. She spoke to him like he was part of a facilities temp service, not a man who once led strategic planning meetings in that very room. Dorian nodded, rose from his seat, and followed her upstairs. The atrium was already half filled with rows of folding chairs, a stage set against the back wall, and a screen bearing the firm's newest slogan, rebranded with vibrant colors and bolder font. He worked silently for 30 minutes, adjusting rows, straightening name tags, reviewing last-minute logistics. At one point, he was asked to move a potted plant that blocked the CEO's sightline. No one said thank you. At 11:55, he stood near the side exit while guests began arriving, all of them dressed in business casual, chatting over catered sandwiches and sparkling water. At noon sharp, Greg Dillon walked onto the stage, the spotlight fixed squarely on him, his voice confident and polished. He opened the town hall by thanking everyone for a quarter of resilience, for adapting to evolving structures, and for embracing new leadership dynamics. He praised several departments, acknowledged recent promotions, and announced a series of internal changes designed to ensure transparency and efficiency. Then, with a small pause, he transitioned into personnel notes. He referenced the importance of cultural alignment, professional agility, and emotional intelligence in today's workplace. He spoke of accountability, of professional presence, of team chemistry. Then he said the company would be moving forward without certain legacy roles that no longer matched the direction of Dillon's strategic partners. He never said Dorian's name, but the crowd knew. Whispers rippled across the back rows. Eyes flicked toward the side of the atrium where Dorian stood. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others stared straight ahead. Greg thanked everyone again for their flexibility and dismissed the meeting with a note about cocktails being served in the main lounge later that evening. The applause was soft, more procedural than genuine. As the crowd dispersed, Dorian remained where he stood. He was not approached, not acknowledged, not even asked to leave. By 3 p.m., his inbox had been locked. His email auto-response now read, "This account is no longer monitored. Please redirect inquiries to department leadership." The first person to speak to him that afternoon was a building services coordinator who asked if he was waiting for someone. Dorian said no. He walked out of the atrium and took the service corridor back to his floor. When he arrived, a moving box sat on his desk. It contained 2 framed certificates, 1 half-full notebook, a nameplate with a label scratched off, and a company pen. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Just the box. He sat beside it for several minutes, then stood, took the box under his arm, and walked down the back stairwell. No one followed. At the ground floor, he passed reception without a single glance from staff. He reached the revolving doors, paused, looked back at the marble lobby with its polished brass finishes, the banners hanging above the welcome desk. Nothing had changed. Not visually. But every fiber of its culture had been rewritten to erase him. Outside, the city buzzed with motion. Buses groaned at curbs, bikes sped past, people shouted into phones. Dorian turned left, walked 2 blocks to the parking garage, and found his access card no longer opened the gate. He waited until another car approached, then slipped through behind it. His car was still there. No vote, no ticket, just silence. He drove home with the windows down. The air was heavy with the scent of early summer, of pavement warmed by noon sun, of things moving on without waiting for permission. When he arrived home, there were no voicemails, no emails, no alerts. Just a single envelope slipped beneath his door. Inside was a standard HR letter stating that he had been placed on unpaid leave pending a formal review, which would take place in 21 business days. No details. No accusations, just a signature from someone he'd never met. Dorian folded the letter, set it on the counter, and stared out the window for a long time. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay in bed replaying every decision, every meeting, every conversation from the past 12 months. Not looking for mistakes, just looking for the moment he stopped being seen. He rose at 5 a.m., brewed coffee, dressed as if going to work, and sat in his living room with the blinds drawn. At 8, he opened his laptop, accessed what few public company portals were still available to him, and found that his employee ID now returned an error code. Account not found. But this morning something different happened. At precisely 9:15, his personal phone lit up with a number he did not recognize. It rang twice before he answered. The voice on the other end was quiet, direct, and carried a weight that cut through the fog that had been draped over him for weeks. The man introduced himself only as Cordell. He asked Dorian if he was available for a conversation regarding Dylan's strategic partners. Dorian said yes. Cordell said he would arrive at Dorian's building in 20 minutes. No request, no details, just a statement. Dorian stood, shaved, changed into a dark suit, and was tying his second cufflink when the buzzer sounded. He opened the door to find a tall, sharply dressed man in his early 60s with eyes like polished onyx, and a presence that shifted the gravity of the room. They sat at the small kitchen table. Cordell said he had been monitoring the Dylan operation closely for the past 6 months. He said a mutual contact had flagged what was happening to Dorian not just as a moral failure, but as a tactical red flag. He opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. Dorian scanned them: partnership contracts, internal memos, strategic compliance clauses. Among them, a signed equity transfer agreement dated 5 years earlier bearing both Greg Dillon's signature and another name Dorian had not seen in years: his late father's. Cordell explained that Dorian was not just a former department head. He was the silent equity holder of 17% of Dylan Strategic Partners' operational arm, a transfer arranged by his father through a secondary entity with controlling interest leverage, masked through a trust designed to mature upon internal review. The clause had activated the moment Dylan's leadership triggered a formal audit by violating its own diversity and ethics charter. Dorian's disappearance, Cordell said, had not gone unnoticed. It had activated legal scrutiny. It had triggered escape clauses in multiple high-value contracts. Cordell leaned forward and said that by Wednesday, Dylan's largest foreign investor would be withdrawing. On Friday, the board would vote to dissolve Greg's executive authority pending review. And Dorian, through inherited equity and the legacy agreement, held veto rights that could determine the company's next phase of life or its end. Dorian did not react at first. His fingers moved slowly across the document edges, reading and rereading, his eyes shifting between numbers, dates, and initials. Cordell waited in silence. Finally, Dorian asked why now. Cordell replied that sometimes injustice must be seen to be believed, and it had taken time for the right people to see it clearly. Dorian closed the folder. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city's jagged skyline. Everything he had built, everything that had been taken from him, stood below in those towers and glass corridors. He turned back to Cordell and asked what would happen if he refused to return. Cordell said the firm would collapse quietly, its leadership reshuffled, and its legacy tarnished. Or, he said, Dorian could take his place at the table, not for revenge, but for restoration, for those watching, for those still inside. That night, Dorian did not sleep. He read every document twice. He traced every line of authority and outlined the sequence of decisions that had dismantled him piece by piece. In the morning, he dressed the way he had before any of it began. Gray suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. He arrived at the Dylan building at 9:52 a.m. The receptionist blinked twice, checked her monitor, and looked up again. "Sir," she began, but then Cordell stepped through the revolving door and greeted Dorian by name, loudly, clearly, and without hesitation. Two security staff paused near the elevator. Cordell nodded to them. They stepped aside. Dorian walked past them, his shoes quiet on the marble, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The elevator ride to the 37th floor took 12 seconds. When the doors opened, 3 executives stood in the corridor mid-conversation. One of them dropped his phone. Dorian kept walking. Greg Dillon was in the middle of a board meeting when the assistant leaned in and whispered something. Greg frowned, then turned pale. Dorian entered the room a moment later. He did not speak at first. He placed the folder on the table and slid it toward the head chair. Greg reached for it. Cordell entered behind Dorian and closed the door. Cordell stood behind Dorian with the calm of someone who had already witnessed the future unfold. Greg Dillon sat frozen, his fingers hovering above the clasp of his briefcase, his mouth slightly open as if caught between an argument and a plea. Dorian began by distributing copies of the founding trust documents that Cordell had unearthed, pages that outlined the legacy equity agreement arranged by Dorian's late father during Dillon's expansion into foreign partnerships. a deal formed in good faith and designed to be activated only under the most corrupt conditions. The clause was specific, detailed, and brutal in its simplicity. Should any executive of Dillon Strategic Partners violate its founding charter through acts of targeted exclusion, racial bias, or systemic manipulation resulting in the marginalization of key stakeholders, the protective clause would activate full voting rights to the primary equity heir. That heir was Dorian Keene. He explained this in measured tone, each word placed with the same precision his colleagues had once used to erase him. He cited timestamps, extracted messages, altered file logs, and silenced protocols enforced by mid-tier managers who now squirmed in their chairs. He pulled up meeting transcripts, where his contributions had been misattributed, and access records showing the deliberate limitations imposed without cause. He outlined performance shifts triggered by anonymous reports from directors now under external audit. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply read the facts. One by one, he showed that he had documented every step of the campaign against him, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity, knowing that survival in a system that weaponized silence required truth recorded in absolute detail. He then presented the letters from Dillon's international partners, statements of intent to withdraw pending investigation of internal discrimination practices. Combined, they represented over $2 billion in future investment. He read the words of their executives, who stated they could not align themselves with a firm that failed to uphold its own charter. Then he revealed his personal statement of control, a signed document prepared with Cordell's legal team, transferring active oversight authority of Dillon Strategic Partners' equity holdings from the trust to Dorian himself, effective immediately. As of that moment, Dorian had full legal authority to appoint or remove executive board members, to veto leadership decisions, and to initiate structural reform with binding consequences. The boardroom did not speak. The silence was no longer cold. It was paralyzed. Greg Dillon's lips finally moved, asking if this was revenge. Dorian responded that it was justice, not just for himself, but for every employee pushed aside, for every voice buried in bureaucratic dust, for every silent exit orchestrated in a hallway under flickering lights. He reminded the room that power is not proven in how one takes the throne, but in how one carries the weight of being unseen. He then requested a vote of no confidence in Greg Dillon's leadership. The board, aware of the legal inevitability, voted unanimously. Greg did not object. He simply gathered his papers, nodded once, and left the room. The next hour was spent outlining the company's realignment. Dorian appointed an interim team to review all previous terminations, starting with those flagged for discriminatory patterns. He directed Cordell to initiate an external audit of all HR procedures and employee evaluations over the past 3 years. He asked that all incoming hires undergo ethics mentorship, not as punishment, but as prevention. Then he left the room. He did not linger. He did not wait for applause. In the elevator, he said nothing. In the lobby, the staff stood still. Some recognized him. Some had only heard the rumors. But all of them turned as he walked past, not because of what he wore or how he carried himself, but because of what he now represented. On the street, Dorian did not call a car. He walked 3 blocks east, 2 blocks south, into the quiet part of the district where office towers gave way to bookstores and corner cafes. He sat outside with a cup of black coffee and a folder on his lap, the same folder that had once sat on his desk in a windowless sublevel, now heavy with signatures and sealed intent. As he looked across the street, he saw reflections of who he had once been. Young professionals rushing into high-rises, interns double-checking their ID cards, assistants glancing nervously at their watches. He had been all of them. He had been invisible to all of them. But not anymore. That evening, Dillon's homepage featured a press release titled Organizational Realignment and Commitment to Equity. It bore Dorian's signature. Within 48 hours of the leadership vote, Greg Dillon's office was empty by legal order, his executive access revoked, his name removed from the partner listing, and his company profile archived. He left behind only a leather chair and a drawer filled with outdated performance memos marked confidential, many of which Dorian had already seen and documented. Greg did not issue a public statement. He did not attempt to fight the outcome. His silence in the face of Dorian's authority spoke volumes about the depths of his guilt and the weight of a legacy he had tried to conceal under polished speeches and strategic exclusion. Caleb Stroud, once a favored proxy used to replace Dorian's visibility with a more compliant version of leadership, received a formal summons to appear before the internal ethics panel. The review presented a timeline of his rapid promotions, project attributions, and internal messages that revealed coordinated efforts to undermine and overwrite Dorian's contributions. When asked to explain the inconsistencies between his reported efforts and actual deliverables, Caleb fumbled through a defense of obedience and executive instruction. The panel was unmoved. By the end of the week, he was placed on administrative leave pending external review. His name no longer appeared on the upcoming Leadership Summit invitation list. In the operations department, Jackson Bird, the compliance manager who had once accused Dorian of passive non-engagement and had submitted anonymous reports resulting in strategic realignment, was confronted with his own communication records, messages riddled with dismissive language, internal jokes at Dorian's expense, and attempts to rally others to isolate non-conforming staff. Jackson attempted to frame the messages as harmless venting, claiming professional stress and cultural misinterpretation, but the damage had already been done. His immediate supervisor recommended termination, and HR issued a formal letter of violation. Brenda Cobb, the HR representative who had framed Dorian's demotion as a developmental opportunity and had orchestrated the seating reassignment that began his public exclusion, was summoned to review internal procedures with a third-party consultancy brought in by Dorian's direction. The audit uncovered a pattern of similar cases involving quiet removals and targeted reclassifications, all documented under her management. She resigned 2 days later without attending her final exit interview. Her desk was cleared by facilities. On the legal floor, Wilson Rudd, the mid-tier partner who had defended Caleb during the fabricated performance review and who had filed the unsigned policy memo against Dorian, faced the most severe consequence of all. The compliance investigation, backed by external law counsel, found his involvement to be more than administrative. He had received bonuses tied to departmental restructuring and had actively encouraged strategic suppression of dissenting employees through policy manipulation. His license was flagged for review, and the State Bar opened an inquiry. He was escorted out by security, not in disgrace, but in stunned disbelief that the institution he had once helped manipulate now turned against him with its own rules. Beyond these individuals, the building began to shift. The elevator that once skipped Dorian's badge now opened at every level without hesitation. His access credentials were restored, but he rarely used them to enter executive spaces. Instead, he walked among departments, asking questions, reviewing forgotten policies, and meeting with mid-level staff who had been ignored for years. Word spread quickly that the new leadership did not hide behind glass, but stood in the hallways and spoke like a peer. The shift in tone was immediate. People began submitting anonymous feedback, not about grievances, but about gratitude. Others volunteered to participate in the ethics audit. One junior analyst, who had once passed Dorian in silence in sublevel 2, now stood and addressed him by name during a departmental huddle, asking what steps would be taken to ensure no one else disappeared. Dorian answered that structure would be rewritten from the ground up and that accountability would begin with transparency, not secrecy. As these changes took root, the financial consequences for the firm arrived in parallel. The international investor, who had withdrawn interest upon witnessing Dorian's erasure, publicly reversed their decision and released a statement of renewed confidence in the company's evolving leadership. Other partners followed, citing the internal reforms as evidence of moral strength and long-term sustainability. Stock projections, which had dipped after the leadership vote, stabilized within days. Reports labeled the turnaround as an unprecedented act of corporate integrity. And yet, Dorian took none of it as victory. He viewed each act of correction not as revenge, but as necessary repair, not just of systems, but of people. He did not gloat. He did not boast. He issued no press statements. Instead, he requested that the company newsletter feature anonymous testimonials from previously terminated employees now being invited back for reevaluation. He directed the firm's resources to support mental health services for those affected by leadership malpractice. He reinstated a mentorship program, not for optics, but for transformation. And then he visited the sublevel floor where his exile had begun. The desk was still there. The closet still bore the same smell of disinfectant. When the dust of consequence settled and the final reports had been filed, when the doors that once hid quiet cruelty now stood wide open to scrutiny, and when the names of those who had disappeared beneath the machinery of corporate ambition were finally spoken aloud with the reverence they deserved, Dorian Keene stood not at the top of a pedestal, but at the center of a new beginning, grounded not by title or wealth, but by the immovable clarity of justice earned through silence endured and integrity preserved. He had seen what unchecked arrogance could build and what its fall could destroy. He had endured its weight not with bitterness, but with patience. And when the time came, he had answered not with fury, but with truth. It was that truth, not the equity, not the board vote, not the clause buried in legacy paperwork, that had reshaped Dillon's strategic partners from the inside out. The firm had begun not just a recovery, but a redefinition. Departments that had once operated in silos now collaborated through open channels. Leadership summits included floor-level employees with equal voice. Orientation for new hires no longer boasted metrics of market dominance, but promises of fairness, mentorship, and protection. Ethics was no longer a policy. It was a practice, lived, enforced, and visible. And yet, among all the transformations, one shift stood above the rest: the return of those who had once failed him, not to reclaim their power, but to face what they had become and seek a path forward. Greg Dillon, the man whose polished charm once masked institutionalized disdain, requested a private meeting with Dorian 6 weeks after his resignation. Dorian agreed. They met not in a boardroom, but in the public garden 2 blocks from the building, a space Greg had likely passed for years without noticing. He arrived wearing no suit, no watch, no mask of authority. He did not attempt to apologize through words alone. Instead, he asked to listen. For an hour, Dorian spoke, not of revenge, not of bitterness, but of systems, of choices, of what it means to be entrusted with influence, and how quickly influence becomes violence when wielded without conscience. Greg did not interrupt. At the end, he asked what he could do to make it right. Dorian said he could begin by speaking to those he once silenced. The following month, Greg began visiting schools in under-resourced districts, giving talks not about his success, but about his failure, not about growth charts, but about humility. He made no headlines. He requested no recognition. He simply began again. Caleb Stroud joined a nonprofit focused on leadership ethics in young professionals. He reached out to Dorian not to regain favor, but to ask for guidance on how to mentor responsibly. Dorian directed him toward the people he had once undermined, instructing him to serve rather than speak. Others followed, each in their own way attempting to face what they had allowed, what they had contributed to, and how they might become better because of it. Not all were forgiven immediately. Some never were. But the door was open, not because Dorian owed them absolution, but because the story itself was not about vengeance. It was about transformation. It was about what happens when the ignored rise, not to crush, but to restore. It was about the enduring truth that power, when stripped of compassion, becomes cruelty, but power rooted in justice creates legacy. Dorian never reclaimed his old title. He declined offers to become CEO. Instead, he served as a silent chair on the Ethics Council, mentoring new leaders, guiding structural reform, and ensuring that the firm's soul could never again be hollowed by unchecked ego. He spent his afternoons walking the same halls where he had once been invisible, speaking to interns, sitting with support staff, learning the names of those who had always been seen last and heard least. His presence became a symbol, not of victory, but of vigilance. And outside those walls, the story of what had happened inside Dillon began to spread. Other firms reached out. Other leaders asked questions. Other victims found the courage to speak. Change did not come quickly. It never does. But it came. Not because Dorian demanded it, but because he had lived it. In the end, he understood something deeper than most. The greatest justice is not found in the fall of the corrupt, but in the rise of the principled. The greatest legacy is not the wealth one amasses, but the lives one protects when no one is watching. And the most meaningful revenge is not retribution. It is the creation of a world where no one else must suffer what you survived. Summary of Stage 10: Redemption and Rebuild. The final stage brings not just justice, but transformation, as those who once oppressed face their reflection and choose to change. Dorian does not seek titles or power, but uses his influence to rebuild a culture of accountability, inclusion, and empathy. Through quiet leadership, he proves that the truest power lies in healing, and the most enduring message is that justice, when rooted in principle, creates a future worth inheriting. The end. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd love to hear what you thought. How did the plot twists hit you? Which moments stood out the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's talk. Your feedback helps shape every story that follows.